Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道这期的热点深度，关注这几天哈马斯组织突袭制造惨剧，以及以色列推进报复行动持续升级的这一场中东的冲突，其影响力波及到中东之外几千几万公里的美国社会和校园。在10月9日，媒体政客报道，哈佛大学有30多个学生组织发表了亲巴勒斯坦谴责以色列的公开信。由34个哈佛学生组织组成的联盟表示，在数十年的对加沙占领之后，以色列政府应该对所有正在发生的暴力行为负全部责任。公开信也说，种族隔离政权是唯一应该受到指责的人。签署这封信的组织包括穆斯林和巴勒斯坦支持团体以及其他具有不同背景的组织，包括哈佛犹太人解放组织和非裔美国人抵抗组织。目前暂时不知道有多少学生是支持这封信。很快哈佛大学的学校方面，哈佛大学校长克劳丁·盖伊和包括15名院长在内的高级领导层在周一发表了声明，说他们对哈马斯本周末对以色列公民的袭击和造成的死亡和破坏感到心碎，但最初的声明是避免直接提及这封学生信或对此的反应。学校领导层是表示，我们并不抱有幻想，认为哈佛大学能够轻易地弥合以色列巴勒斯坦冲突中存在的广泛不同观点，但我们希望作为一个致力于学习的社区，我们可以采取措施，利用我们的共同人性和共同价值观，为了调节而不是放大更广泛世界中如此明显的根深蒂固的分歧和敌意。根据政客的报道，这封公开信可能会对今年夏天刚刚成为哈佛大学校长的克劳丁·盖伊来说是个巨大挑战。该大学经常也成为保守派批评的目标，认为哈佛的高等教育是迎合精英并传授自由主义观点。一般认为哈佛大学是美国政界最有影响力的大学了，培养了8位前总统和9位现任最高法院法官中的4位大法官。这封公开信一经曝光，就激起了一些校友们的愤怒。前总统克林顿时期的美国前财政部部长，同时也是前哈佛大学校长的劳伦斯·萨默斯这个人物之前我们的李奇同事也是经常给我们分享和他有关的文章。那萨默斯是批评哈佛现任领导层未能对这一封公开信做出回应的几位哈佛毕业生之一。萨默斯在他的社交媒体平台 X 上写道，哈佛领导层的沉默让哈佛针对以色列犹太国的这个恐怖行为显现中立，对此我感到恶心。在遭到强烈的反对之后呢，哈佛大学领导层是在这个稍后发表了一份声明，其中校长克劳丁·盖伊说，随着最近几天的事件持续回响，我毫无疑问地谴责哈马斯犯下的恐怖主义暴行，无论个人对该地区长期冲突的根源有何看法，这种不人道的行为都是令人憎恶的。克劳丁·盖伊还说我要声明的还有在这个问题上和其他的问题上，虽然我们的学生有着权利为自己说话，但没有一个学生团体甚至30个学生团体可以代表哈佛大学或其他领导层发言。盖伊认为，在这样一个困难的时期，旨在启发而不是煽动的言论会对我们所有人都有好处。他呼吁这个学习社区中的所有人在我们继续对话时牢记这一点。大学传统上一直是言论自由和激进思想的堡垒，所以这一次以色列这个国家和哈马斯这个组织冲突持续的升级，让支持巴勒斯坦的声浪不只出现在美国的哈佛，其他许多的顶尖大学，包括纽约大学、哥伦比亚大学、史丹福大学等等，学生们将暴力冲突责任归咎于以色列，并称巴勒斯坦人有权反抗压迫和占领。路透社的报道提到，纽约大学法学院的学生律师协会主席沃克曼在本周协会电子报中写道，这周我首先想说，也最重要的是，针对巴勒斯坦人反抗压迫、追求解放及自决，我向他们表达坚定不移且绝对同在的支持。他还说以色列要为牺牲的无数生命负全部责任。 这份电子报在社交媒体平台上遭转发多次，并引来了数十位各界领袖、社运人士以及议员们的抨击。纽约大学犹太学生团体与校友也要求校方采取行动。最后，沃克曼被指就哈马斯袭击以色列发表了具煽动性的言论，一间知名的国际律师事务所因而撤回了对沃克曼的工作申请。本来沃克曼本受聘于温斯顿律师事务所，该事务所拥有位于曼哈顿中城的这个 MetLife 的大楼，其业务也是遍及美国的芝加哥、华盛顿特区、伦敦、香港，还有巴黎，还有中国的上海。对沃克曼在社交媒体上的立场也表示谴责。该公司在 X 上发布声明说，指出沃克曼的言论与律师事务所的价值观存在深刻的冲突，并取消聘请该法学院的学生，称沃克曼为前实习律师。纽约大学法学院院长特洛伊·麦肯齐也在10月10日向法学院社区发出的信息中试图让学校和沃克曼的言论保持距离，称他们的信息不是来自学校，也不代表学校的领导层。该校指学生会的声明不反映纽约大学的观点。纽约大学是指恐怖主义是不道德的，无差别杀害平民和劫持人质，包括儿童和老人是可耻的，又将恐怖主义受害者的死亡归咎于他们自己属错误。然而事情还没有结束。潘兴广场资本管理公司 CEO 比尔·阿克曼，这位被称为小巴菲特的亿万富翁，在10月10日在他的社交媒体 X 上发文说，很多首席执行官们问我哈佛会否公布发出这封将哈马斯令人发指的行为全部的责任归咎于以色列的信的哈佛大学各组织的成员名单，以确保我们不会无意中雇佣他们的任何成员。阿克曼也说如果实际上他们的成员支持他们发布的这封信，那么签署者的名字就应该公开，以便他们的观点为公众所知。这位净资产超过35亿美元的哈佛大学毕业生还补充，在发表支持恐怖分子行为的声明时，人们不应该能够躲在企业的盾牌后面。我们现在了解到恐怖分子杀害了婴儿以及其他难以置信的卑鄙行为。而根据媒体商业内幕，X 用户对于阿克曼要求公开学生姓名的看法则反应不一。有些执行长回文表达赞同，也有人认为为了大学生因为身为团体成员就被指名道姓也不公平，毕竟他们有可能会不同意上述的这一封联署公开信。再回到这一封哈佛大学30多个学生组织发表亲巴勒斯坦谴责以色列的公开信，因为这篇声明引发的反抗声浪实在太大，联署团体名单后来被删掉。哈佛的巴勒斯坦团结委员会在 Instagram 上贴文说，这么做是为了保护受影响的学生的安全。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容，更多资讯可以关注六度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
An intelligence failure is like a plane crash. It is never just one thing that goes wrong, it is instead a series of things that add up to a disaster. Hamas pulled off a complex, multi-front assault on October 7th, the kind of coordinated attack that takes months to plan and execute. Moreover, tens if not hundreds of Hamas militants were involved in the combination air, land, sea, and rocket assault, suggesting that the circle of knowledge was extensive. Further, Tehran helped plan and fund the endeavor, according to the Wall Street Journal, with meetings taking place in Beirut, which means the circle of knowledge encompassed at least 3 locations. At first blush, the situation appears to be a massive intelligence failure. So how could Israeli intelligence services, among the best in the world, be caught by surprise? It happens to the best of us, and the aftermath is both professionally and personally painful. Examining the root causes of the failure with clear eyes and an open mind is essential to avoiding the same mistakes in the future. While we do not yet and may never know the complete story of this intelligence failure, there are some likely possibilities for the root cause. The first question investigators will ask is whether Shin Bet, Mossad, and the Israel Defense Forces issued warnings of an impending attack. Were warnings specific and actionable, or too general? One of the most infamous examples of general warning was the President's daily brief written in August 2001, titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." The 9/11 Commission report indicated that 2 CIA analysts involved in preparing this briefing article believed it represented an opportunity to communicate their view that the threat of a bin Laden attack in the United States remained both current and serious. But the message intended was different than the message received. President Bush said the article told him that Al-Qaeda was dangerous, which he had known since he had become president. The intelligence community knew plotting was ongoing, but the warning was too general to result in decisive, preventive action or improved defenses. Policymakers often expect precision. An attack by this entity will occur at this place at this time. Rarely, if ever, does a picture that clear come together. The Hamas assault on Israel may turn into a case of nonspecific warning. Some reports indicate that U.S. and Israeli intelligence were watching for rising tensions, but there was no precise warning of an impending attack. The New York Times reported that Israeli intelligence issued a specific warning to border guards immediately before the attack, flagging a surge in activity, but those warnings went unheeded for unclear reasons. Next, investigators will examine whether their services had collected information on the potential attack and were holding it in their systems. Investigators will scrub databases for indications that Hamas was planning a massive strike, including from established intelligence sources and from an array of less credible sources, from hearsay to walk-ins. Hindsight is, of course, 20/20, and this exercise always risks turning up information no analyst would have considered credible at the time but now seems prescient. If that search turns up information pointing to an impending attack, the next question is why the information in question did not prompt a warning. Was it translated and disseminated? Did analysts read it? If not, why not? If they did read it, why did they discount its importance? Interviews with analysts will be important in this phase, and while those discussions could feel accusatory, investigators should approach these conversations with curiosity and a forward-looking approach. This is the same approach congressional committees should take when conducting their own investigations. If information was there, and analysts missed it or dismissed it, the intelligence services faced the most painful outcome, an analytical failure brought on by human error. These are often failures of imagination, where analysts know something is coming, but they neglect to think as big and as ruthlessly as their adversary. If this is the case, the organization needs to carefully consider retraining staff and initiating cultural or staffing changes. If it turns out the indications were there, but holiday leave got in the way of warning, the intelligence services are likely looking at hours at their desks over holiday weekends in the future. Commentators have speculated about whether extensive political protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu may have also been a distraction. While only time will tell if domestic turmoil played a role, it is unlikely. Intelligence professionals pride themselves on staying mission-focused, particularly with a mission as important as protecting Israel from terrorist attacks. But assume for a moment that the search for information in the existing holdings comes up dry, or the results are quite thin enough that no rational analyst could have connected the dots to warn of a massive Hamas attack, much less on a certain day. Then, the investigators need to explore whether this failure came from collection gaps. First-class intelligence services like the Israelis have a list of priorities for collection. For Jerusalem, at the top of that list is always Palestinian terrorist groups and their Iranian supporters. Iran in particular poses a potentially existential threat to the state of Israel, and the rulers in Tehran have threatened Israel's existence with every tool in their toolkit. Hamas, therefore, would be a perennial high-priority target for Israeli intelligence. Tehran would be too, along with Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon. First-class intelligence services also hedge their bets. No intelligence officer wants a single thread of information on a top threat. Instead, officers plan for multiple routes of entry, SIGINT, phone and internet tapping to read the adversary's communications, IMINT, overhead images of adversary activity, and human sources reporting on the inner workings of an adversary, for the secrets that cannot be stolen any other way. The Israeli services are best in class for computer network operations, like clandestine entry into adversary phones and computer systems. Their capabilities so good and so sneaky they have caused more than a little controversy. Further, for each of these INTs, collectors will develop multiple streams of access, so if one is discovered or shut down, others are still reporting. So where was the collection on the Hamas operation? Charitably, it is possible the Israeli services had few to no human sources. Gaza is a closed society, and Hamas is in charge of most things. Someone spying for Israel would risk both death and the safety of their entire family. It is possible that human sources were either not reporting or had been discovered. SIGINT, then? Did Israeli operations to penetrate Hamas computer networks and communications fail to collect information? Those kinds of accesses can be fragile. An updated operating system or effective patching of vulnerabilities can kick spies out of long-held accesses. The role of Iran here needs to be examined. Much like Tehran provides rocket technology and financial aid to Hamas, they likely also provide assistance with cyber defense, having been the target of a great many cyber operations themselves. It is possible that in the run-up to such a large operation, Hamas, with Iran's help, undertook an extensive cyber cleanup campaign. Further, Hamas engaged in a classic denial and deception scheme. On a line they knew was monitored by the Israeli services, they talked to each other about how they were not eager to renew hostilities and were still recovering from the two-week conflict in May 2021. The scheme worked. In a briefing for senior Israeli security officials last week, briefers assessed that Hamas had been effectively deterred. Finally, good operational security can go a long way. Hamas might have kept the planning circle for the attack very small, and when it needed to expand to include all the players, they almost certainly compartmentalized the planning. The paragliders likely had no idea about the pending rocket attack. The amphibious operators likely were unaware of the effort to breach the border wall. Only a small number of people would have known the full extent of the plan, and they would have been careful to discuss it only in person, with cell phones outside the room. Israeli leaders have publicly acknowledged that they were surprised by the attack, but they have also brushed away questions about intelligence failures. They rightly point out that they are at war, and that focus must remain on finding the perpetrators of the attack and the hostages they took. When the initial wave of responses abates, the hard work of taking apart the last few months and identifying what went wrong will begin, so this kind of intelligence failure does not happen again. On October 7, 2023, Hamas militants launched an unprecedented attack on Israel. After 4 days, Hamas killed more than 1,200 Israelis and took at least 150 hostages. In response, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared Israel was at war and mobilized roughly 360,000 army reserves. Israel responded with thousands of strikes on cities in the blockaded Gaza Strip, killing more than 1,000 Palestinians and destroying dozens of buildings. The United States deployed 2 carrier strike groups near Lebanon to deter regional actors from further escalation. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militant organization, launched rockets into northern Israel but has not yet launched its own offensive on Israel. On October 11, 2023, Prime Minister Netanyahu and opposition member of parliament Benny Gantz formed a national unity government, which will preside over the ongoing war in Israel's expected ground invasion of Gaza. Question 1. What was the strategic value of Hamas's attack? Hamas was probably more successful than it thought it would be, but also more successful than it should have been for its own good. In 1973, the Egyptian military breached Israeli defenses on the Suez Canal and was only briefly in Sinai before Israeli troops pushed it back over the canal, stopping 100 kilometers outside of Cairo. Regardless, the Egyptian military still celebrates October 6 as the day of its greatest victory. Egypt's ability to penetrate Israel even briefly was a victory that continues to resonate a half-century later. Hamas aimed to penetrate Israel in a way that would give it centrality and relevance for decades to come, but by killing hundreds of Israelis and taking 150 hostages in the first days, Hamas has put itself in an impossible position. Israel is united in its determination to change the status quo ante and completely push Hamas from power. It is hard to imagine that Hamas will be able to retain power in Gaza when the dust settles. There may be hope for the Palestinian national cause, but there's very little hope for Hamas. Question 2. How could the status quo ante change in Gaza? Since Hamas took power in 2007, the Israeli military periodically would go into Gaza, fight with Hamas, and destroy some of its infrastructure. Hamas would rebuild for a few years, and then the cycle would repeat itself. Israelis called this mowing the grass, an unpleasant but necessary repetitive task. This cycle is no longer going to be acceptable to the Israeli public or political leadership. Now, the question is what kind of government will emerge in Gaza after the war? It might entail greater control for the Palestinian National Authority based in Ramallah, some sort of new local governance under the tutelage of the Israeli military, or perhaps a coalition of Arab states. There are a lot of possibilities, but it is hard to imagine that Hamas can remain in power. Question 3. How will the hostage situation affect what happens next? The hostage situation is unprecedented. Hamas took so many hostages from so many different places, threatened to use them as human shields, and threatened to execute them as part of its war aims. The Israelis have said that the hostages will not affect their calculations, but that is likely untrue. At the same time, Israel is not likely to forego its determination to have a comprehensive ground operation in Gaza that pushes Hamas from power because of the hostages. It is unclear how Hamas is going to try to use social media as a tool in the hostage crisis. Strategically, Israel will likely act irrespective of the hostages while tactically trying to free hostages in any way that it can. Social media coverage of the hostages could change this, but it is unlikely. Question 4. How are external actors like Hezbollah thinking about what's happening? The risks for escalation are real, but it is unlikely that Hezbollah had any advance notice this was coming. In fact, most people in the Hamas leadership probably did not know this was coming. Hezbollah feels it has a lot to lose. The Lebanese economy is in crisis. Lebanon went from being a middle-income state to a state where 80 to 85% of the population is below the poverty line. There is no question that an all-out war with Israel would result in the complete destruction of the south and large-scale destruction in other parts of Lebanon, and Hezbollah does not know if it could survive that outcome. Lebanon is very vulnerable now, and the last thing it needs is another war with Israel. Hezbollah leadership has the instinct to give moral and psychological support to Hamas without incurring Israel's full wrath. Israel's instinct is not to get into a spiral of escalation with Hezbollah that can turn this into a two-front war, especially because Hezbollah is much better armed than Hamas. Hezbollah has up to 150,000 rockets and missiles, many of which were supplied through Syria. It is spread over a much larger area than the Gaza Strip. And Israel does not control all the access points to Lebanon the way it controls the access points to the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah does not want to be seen sitting on its hands, but it also does not want to provoke a full-scale Israeli response. Any number of things could change that, including Israeli attacks that create extraordinary humanitarian suffering or images of lots of maimed women and children. Question 5. How will the war affect regional alignments? The war makes it harder for Arab states to deal with Israel in the near term. In the longer term, it may create possibilities for Arab engagement with Gaza, which could actually contribute to Arab-Israeli rapprochement. Israel and the Arab states are strategically aligned on Gaza. Virtually all Arab governments are hostile to Hamas, which is essentially the Palestinian version of the Muslim Brotherhood. Many of these states have outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood and jailed its members. They also fear the tentacles of Iran, which has helped bankroll Hamas and train some of its fighters. Arab governments may have a role in helping shape a political outcome in Gaza that simultaneously helps advance Palestinian national aspirations while also dealing a blow to Islamist movements and Iranian proxies. I have frequently commented on the growing number of anti-China proposals in the Congress and the competition among members of Congress to produce ever more stringent bills. Many of these are statement bills. They will never become law, and their authors may not particularly care about that, since they are more interested in making a statement than in actually legislating. Lately, however, the proposals have escalated, and their chances of enactment have also increased. The latest and best example is the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act of 2023, popularly known as the Barr Bill, named after its author Congressman Andy Barr, Republican, Kentucky. The bill has been approved by the House Financial Services Committee, but rather than attempting to pass it in the full House, it appears its proponents may seek to add it in conference to the annual defense authorization. Discussing the bill requires a bit of context. The federal government maintains a number of lists of bad guys, companies and individuals determined to have engaged in activities deemed inimical to a variety of U.S. interests. The lists include the Chinese Military Companies List, the Chinese Military Industrial Companies List, the Entity List, the Military End User List, and the Denied Persons List. These lists each have a different statutory basis and were developed for different reasons. The Chinese Military Companies List, for example, is a list of Chinese companies doing business with China's military. It is cautionary, there is no penalty imposed on companies on the list. Placement on the Commerce Department's entity list, in contrast, means a license is required for all exports to that entity, potentially significantly restricting trade. The mother of all lists is the Treasury Department's Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, or SDN list. If you are on that list, your U.S. assets are frozen, it is illegal for U.S. parties to engage in transactions with you, and you will find very few financial institutions anywhere in the world willing to engage in dollar-denominated transactions with you. The intention of the Barr Bill is to push the Treasury Department to add the entities on these other lists to its SDN list if they are not already there. The effect of that would be to impose an economic nuclear option on entities the government has not determined deserve it. In addition, taking such an action would create enormous problems for U.S. companies trying to do business in China. For example, the three China companies that operate cellular telephone networks in China, China Mobile Communications Group Company, Limited, China United Network Communications Group Company, Limited, China Unicom, and China Telecom Corporation Limited, are all on one of the other lists. If they are put on the SDN list, Americans and U.S. companies in China would be prohibited from contracting with them or their Chinese subsidiaries for telecommunications services in China. U.S. telecom companies would also be unable to contract with them to provide roaming services for Americans visiting China. The three companies also are responsible for testing and approving chips being incorporated into cell phones in China. If they were on the SDN list, U.S. manufacturers would not be able to get their chip-containing products certified, excluding from the Chinese market not only U.S. phones but products like autos and appliances that contain chips to connect to the Internet of Things. And this is only one example. Defenders of the Barr Bill argue that it requires the Treasury Department to consider putting additional entities on their list but does not require it to do so, and the Treasury Department will use its authority responsibly. That may be true if we have a responsible administration, like the current one, but that would be far from certain under a different president. It also begs the question, if you only want the Treasury Department to act responsibly, why encourage it to act irresponsibly? Sadly, this is not the only example of paranoia. Bills have been introduced in the Texas legislature to bar Chinese students and Iranians, Russians, and North Koreans from attending Texas public colleges and universities and from buying property in Texas. We are also seeing a wave of bills preventing Chinese from buying farmland, even though the government already has authority to block any specific investment for national security reasons such as the property being adjacent to a military facility. Measures like these only serve to drive us further apart. One would think that educating Chinese students in the United States would be a good thing. They would learn about democracy and the history and culture of our country outside the reach of Chinese propaganda. If they end up staying here, we get the benefit of their talent. If they go back to China, they take part of us with them. We win either way. The fear seems to be that some of them are spies. Some of them probably are, but banning all of them is a classic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It also demeans us as a people afraid to interact with others that might have different points of view.